Did you know that a dead body deceived the entire Nazi leadership? And that a Japanese soldier fought for more than 28 years after the war because he didn't believe it was over? We've gathered 50 interesting facts about World War II that will surprise and make you think. If you're interested, stay with us and subscribe so you don't miss any more exciting war stories. Let's get started. Fact 1. The war begins. September 1st, 1939. At dawn, German forces crossed into Poland, marking the beginning of World War II. This wasn't just another border skirmish. It was the start of a carefully orchestrated blitzkrieg, or lightning war, that would reshape the world. Within hours, the Polish city of Wielun was devastated by German bombers, even though it had no military installations. Britain and France, honoring their commitment to Poland, declared war on Germany 2 days later. What began as a regional conflict would soon engulf the entire planet in a struggle that would last 6 brutal years. Fact 2. The final surrender. September 2nd, 1945. Aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the Instrument of Surrender, finally bringing World War II to its conclusion. This moment came after atomic bombs had devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki just weeks earlier, forcing Emperor Hirohito to make the unprecedented decision to surrender. The ceremony was deliberately staged. General Douglas MacArthur accepted the surrender as cameras rolled, documenting this pivotal moment for history. From the invasion of Poland to this somber ceremony on a battleship's deck, the war had lasted exactly 6 years and 1 day, transforming every continent it touched. Fact 3. A global mobilization. Over 100 million people were mobilized for military service during World War II, a number so staggering it's hard to comprehend. To put this in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to the entire population of Mexico today, all in uniform. The Soviet Union alone mobilized 34 million people, while the United States called up 16 million. This wasn't just professional soldiers. Farmers, teachers, factory workers, and students from every walk of life suddenly found themselves on battlefields from North Africa to the Pacific Islands. Entire generations of young men disappeared from their communities, leaving behind a world that would never be quite the same. Fact 4. A world at war. More than 60 countries declared war during this conflict, turning World War II into truly the first global war in human history. Nations from every inhabited continent took sides, from the obvious major powers like the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, to smaller nations like Costa Rica, Liberia, and even Mongolia. Some countries like Brazil sent troops to fight in Europe despite being thousands of miles away. Others, like Thailand, were forced to choose sides under threat of invasion. By the war's end, only a handful of nations remained officially neutral. Among them, Switzerland, Sweden, and Ireland, though even they felt the war's devastating economic and social impact. Fact 5. The deadliest conflict. More than 70 million people died in World War II, making it the deadliest conflict in human history. To understand this scale, imagine the entire population of the United Kingdom simply vanishing. That's how many lives were lost. This number includes not just soldiers killed in combat, but countless civilians who died from bombing raids, starvation, disease, and genocide. In Leningrad alone, over 1 million civilians starved to death during a 900-day siege. The Chinese city of Nanjing saw between 200,000 and 300,000 civilians massacred in just 6 weeks. These weren't just statistics. Each number represented someone's parent, child, sibling, or friend, leaving holes in families and communities that would never be filled. Fact 6. The Soviet sacrifice. The Soviet Union lost approximately 27 million people, nearly 14% of its entire pre-war population. This staggering toll dwarfs the losses of any other nation in the conflict. To put this in perspective, that's more than the combined losses of all Western Allied nations, multiplied several times over. Every single family in the Soviet Union was touched by death. There wasn't a household that didn't lose someone. The city of Stalingrad became a symbol of this sacrifice, where brutal house-to-house fighting turned the city into a graveyard, with Soviet forces suffering over 1 million casualties. Even today, Russians continue to unearth remains of soldiers who fell defending their homeland, a grim reminder of the price they paid for victory. Fact 7. Economic transformation. By the height of the war, over 75% of the world's GDP was being funneled into war production, an economic transformation unprecedented in history. Factories that once made cars now churned out tanks and aircraft at incredible speeds. In the United States, Ford's Willow Run plant produced one B-24 bomber every single hour at its peak. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers to replace men who'd gone to fight, fundamentally changing society. Rationing became a way of life. Families saved cooking grease, grew victory gardens, and lived with shortages of everything from sugar to gasoline. The entire global economy became a war machine, producing weapons and supplies at a pace never seen before or since. Fact 8. The Holocaust. 6 million Jews were systematically murdered by the Nazi regime in what we now call the Holocaust, the deliberate industrialized genocide of an entire people. This wasn't collateral damage or a byproduct of war. It was a calculated program of extermination. The Nazis built death camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, where up to 6,000 people could be murdered in a single day using poison gas. Families were torn apart on arrival. Those deemed unable to work were sent immediately to gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. The Nazis kept meticulous records of their crimes, documenting the theft of victims' belongings, even gold dental fillings. Beyond the 6 million Jews, millions of others, Roma people, disabled individuals, homosexuals, and political prisoners, were also murdered in this systematic campaign of hatred. Fact 9. Europe in ruins. By 1945, more than 40% of European cities lay in ruins, their infrastructure destroyed, and populations displaced. Warsaw, Poland's capital, was 85% destroyed. The Nazis systematically demolished what remained after the Warsaw Uprising. Dresden, once called the Florence of the Elbe, was reduced to rubble in a single night of firebombing. In Germany, 20 million people were homeless, living in cellars and ruins. The ancient city centers of Cologne, Berlin, and Hamburg were transformed into apocalyptic landscapes of twisted metal and broken stone. Photographs from this era show survivors walking through streets where they can barely recognize their own neighborhoods. The familiar landmarks of their lives simply erased from existence. Fact 10. The dawn of radar. When war broke out in 1939, radar technology was still in its infancy, and most countries didn't possess it at all. Britain's pioneering chain-home radar system, operational just before the war, became a game-changer during the Battle of Britain, giving the RAF precious minutes of warning before German bombers arrived. This technological advantage helped save Britain from invasion in 1940. By contrast, Pearl Harbor happened partly because American radar operators, using primitive equipment, mistook the incoming Japanese attack for a flight of American B-17 bombers. Within 6 years, radar evolved from an experimental curiosity to an essential technology. By war's end, it was guiding bombers through clouds, helping ships detect submarines, and even being miniaturized for use in night fighters. The war had accelerated decades of technological development into just a few years. Fact 11. The atomic age begins. August 6th and 9th, 1945, two atomic bombs, Little Boy and Fat Man, were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, introducing humanity to the terrifying power of nuclear weapons. In an instant, Hiroshima's downtown was vaporized, with temperatures at ground zero reaching 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the surface of the sun. Shadows of people were permanently burned into walls and pavements, the only trace left of those standing too close to the blast. The bomb dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later killed another 70,000 people instantly. These weren't just military weapons, they were world changers that ushered in the atomic age and the Cold War. Survivors, known as hibakusha, suffered from radiation sickness for decades, their bodies bearing witness to humanity's most destructive invention. Fact 12. Reaching for space. The German V-2 rocket became the first human-made object to reach space in 1944, crossing the boundary at 62 miles altitude during a test flight. Designed by Wernher von Braun and his team, these 46-foot-tall missiles were technological marvels and weapons of terror. Traveling faster than the speed of sound, they struck London with no warning, just a sudden explosion. Over 3,000 V-2s were launched during the war, mostly by slave laborers in underground factories where more people died building them than were killed by them. After the war, both the United States and Soviet Union scrambled to capture V-2 technology and German scientists, knowing these rockets held the key to the space age. Von Braun himself would later design the Saturn V rocket that took Americans to the moon, a strange redemption for technology born from war. Fact 13. The first computer takes flight. The B-29 Superfortress wasn't just a bomber. It was a flying technological marvel, and the first aircraft equipped with an onboard analog computer. This revolutionary aircraft featured a centralized fire control system, where gunners aimed through computerized sights that automatically calculated bullet drop, wind speed, and target distance. The plane's pressurized cabin allowed crews to fly at altitudes over 30,000 feet without oxygen masks, something previously impossible. Each B-29 cost $639,000, more expensive than the entire Manhattan Project's initial budget. These massive bombers, with their 141-foot wingspan, represented the cutting edge of 1940s engineering. It was a B-29, the Enola Gay, that delivered the atomic bomb to Hiroshima, forever linking this technological achievement with humanity's most destructive moment. Fact 14. Jets enter combat. The Messerschmitt Me-262 roared into combat in 1944 as the world's first operational jet fighter, leaving Allied propeller planes struggling to keep up. With a top speed of 540 miles per hour, about 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter, it seemed like something from science fiction. German pilots described the feeling of acceleration as being pushed by angels, as the twin-jet engines propelled them forward with unprecedented power. In the right hands, a single Me-262 could tear through a bomber formation before escorts could react. However, Hitler's insistence that it be modified as a bomber rather than a pure fighter delayed its impact. By the time substantial numbers entered service, Germany was already losing. They had built a plane for the future, but introduced it in the final days of their past. Fact 15. Breaking Enigma. At Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion in the English countryside, British codebreakers achieved one of the war's greatest secret victories, cracking the German Enigma cipher machine. Led by brilliant mathematician Alan Turing, this team built the bomb, an electromechanical device that could test thousands of Enigma settings per hour, searching for the day's correct code. The Enigma machine, which the Germans believed was unbreakable, had 159 million possible settings. Yet the Bletchley team cracked it anyway. Intelligence gained from reading encrypted German messages, codenamed Ultra, helped win the Battle of the Atlantic, allowed the Allies to deceive Hitler about D-Day's location, and shortened the war by an estimated 2 years. Turing's work at Bletchley laid the foundation for modern computer science, though his contributions remained classified until decades after his tragic death. Fact 16. The first chain reaction, December 2, 1942. Beneath the stands of the University of Chicago's football stadium, physicist Enrico Fermi achieved the first controlled nuclear chain reaction in human history. Chicago Pile 1, as the reactor was called, was a crude structure of graphite blocks and uranium, built literally by hand with no safety containment. If something went wrong, downtown Chicago could have been contaminated. As Fermi carefully withdrew the control rods, neutron counters began clicking faster and faster, confirming that atoms were splitting and releasing energy in a self-sustaining reaction. The experiment lasted 28 minutes before Fermi calmly ordered the control rods reinserted, shutting it down. Physicist Eugene Wigner produced a bottle of Chianti to celebrate, and everyone present signed the wicker basket. They knew they'd just changed the world forever, for better and worse. Fact 17. The miracle drug. Penicillin, discovered by accident in 1928, remained a laboratory curiosity until World War II forced its mass production, ultimately saving millions of lives. Before penicillin, a simple infected wound could kill a soldier. During World War I, more men died from infected wounds than from the wounds themselves. By D-Day in 1944, Allied pharmaceutical companies were producing enough penicillin to treat every wounded soldier, turning previously fatal infections into treatable conditions. The difference was staggering. Survival rates from battlefield wounds jumped dramatically. American and British scientists shared their production methods freely with each other, but kept them secret from the Axis powers. Penicillin became a genuine military advantage. German soldiers continued dying from infected wounds, while Allied soldiers recovered, a hidden factor that shifted the war's outcome and revolutionized medicine forever. Fact 18. Germany's fuel weakness. Most German tanks ran on gasoline rather than diesel, a strategic vulnerability that would help doom their war effort. Gasoline engines were lighter and more powerful, perfect for the blitzkrieg tactics Germany favored, but they had a fatal flaw. They were dangerously flammable. A single armor-piercing round could turn a gasoline-fueled panzer into an inferno in seconds, earning them the grim nickname Tommy Cookers among Allied troops. Even worse, Germany lacked access to oil fields and had to produce synthetic fuel from coal at enormous expense. As the war progressed and Allied bombing destroyed synthetic fuel plants, German tanks literally ran out of gas. By 1945, Germany had thousands of sophisticated tanks, but many sat immobile, out of fuel, as Soviet forces advanced. The Wehrmacht's impressive armor had become nothing more than expensive stationary pillboxes. Fact 19. The arsenal of democracy. By 1944, Allied factories were producing over 300,000 aircraft annually, a manufacturing achievement so massive it defied comprehension. American factories alone built one aircraft every 5 minutes around the clock. Henry Ford's Willow Run plant stretched over a mile long and could produce a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes at peak efficiency. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda. Women made up 65% of the aviation industry workforce, building everything from fighters to heavy bombers. The United States outproduced all Axis nations combined, delivering not just to American forces, but supplying Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies through Lend-Lease. This wasn't just about quantity. By war's end, American aircraft were technologically superior too. Germany and Japan simply couldn't compete with this industrial tsunami. They were being buried under an avalanche of American-made aircraft. Fact 20. The kamikaze terror. Over 3,800 Japanese pilots deliberately flew their aircraft into Allied ships in kamikaze attacks, a desperate tactic born from Japan's deteriorating military situation. The word kamikaze means divine wind, referencing typhoons that saved Japan from Mongol invasion in the 13th century. These weren't suicidal fanatics, but often young, educated men who believed their sacrifice would save their homeland and families. Before their final flights, they wrote farewell letters, drank ceremonial sake, and tied headbands bearing the rising sun around their flight helmets. The psychological impact on Allied sailors was enormous. How do you defend against an enemy who sees death as victory? Kamikazes sank 34 Allied ships and damaged 368 others. But they couldn't change the war's outcome. These attacks represented Japan's desperation. When conventional warfare failed, they weaponized their pilots' lives. A grim testament to how total World War II had become. Fact 21. The perfect deception. Operation Double Cross was British intelligence's masterpiece. They captured every single German spy sent to Britain and turned them into double agents working against the Third Reich. This wasn't just a few lucky captures. It was a systematic dismantling of German intelligence operations. MI5 didn't simply arrest these spies. They gave them a choice: work for us or face execution. Almost all chose survival and became unwitting tools of British deception. These double agents fed false information back to Berlin, helping to convince Hitler that D-Day would land at Calais instead of Normandy. The operation was so successful that by 1944, the Germans had no genuine intelligence coming from Britain at all. Every report they received was carefully crafted British fiction. Hitler was making decisions based on lies, fed to him by his own spy network. Fact 22. The strangest. Invisible ink. Nazi scientists developed an invisible ink that could only be revealed by one surprising substance: human urine. This bizarre method actually had scientific logic. The ammonia in urine would react with the chemicals in the invisible ink, making the hidden message visible. German agents were trained to write innocuous letters with secret messages hidden between the lines, which could be revealed by their handlers back in Berlin. However, British counterintelligence discovered this technique early in the war, and postal censors began routinely testing suspicious letters with various reagents, including urine. The fact that such a crude substance became part of high-stakes espionage shows how desperate and creative the intelligence war became. It also provided MI5 with another way to identify German agents, as anyone carrying letters treated with this particular invisible ink was immediately suspect. Fact 23. The man who never was. Operation Mincemeat was one of history's most macabre and successful deceptions. British intelligence obtained a corpse, dressed it as a Royal Marines officer, and floated it off the Spanish coast carrying fake invasion plans. The body, given the identity Major William Martin, carried documents suggesting the Allies would invade Greece and Sardinia rather than Sicily, their actual target. Spanish authorities, sympathetic to Germany, passed the documents to Nazi intelligence exactly as the British hoped. Hitler fell for it completely, redirecting troops away from Sicily to defend Greece. When Allied forces landed in Sicily in July 1943, they faced lighter resistance than expected. Soldiers were fighting and dying elsewhere because of a dead man's false briefcase. The operation was so secret that the family of the man whose body was used didn't learn the truth for decades. Facts 24. The secret. Even the vice president didn't know. The Manhattan Project was compartmentalized so strictly that Vice President Harry Truman had no idea America was building an atomic bomb until he became president after Roosevelt's death. Truman had been vice president for 82 days, a heartbeat from the presidency, yet was kept completely in the dark about a project employing 130,000 people and costing $2 billion. When he was finally briefed on April 12, 1945, the day Roosevelt died. Truman was stunned, suddenly responsible for deciding whether to use the most powerful weapon ever created. Workers at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, processed uranium and plutonium without knowing what they were making. They were told only that their work would help end the war. This extreme secrecy was so effective that the Soviet Union learned about the Manhattan Project through espionage before America's own vice president was informed. Fact 25. Birth of napalm. British scientists developed an incendiary weapon nicknamed Dragon's Blood, a sticky, flammable gel that clung to surfaces and burned ferociously, becoming the predecessor to napalm. Traditional incendiary bombs scattered burning material that could be extinguished, but this gel stuck to whatever it touched, making it nearly impossible to put out. The formula combined rubber or latex with gasoline, creating a substance that would stick to buildings, vehicles, and tragically, human skin. American chemists at Harvard refined the formula further, creating napalm, a portmanteau of its key ingredients, naphthenic and palmitic acids. Napalm's first major use came in the firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945, where it created firestorms that killed more people than the atomic bombs would. What began as a British laboratory experiment became one of the war's most horrifying weapons, continuing to see use in conflicts for decades afterward. Fact 26. Time's controversial choice. In 1938, Adolf Hitler was named Time magazine's Man of the Year, not as an honor, but as recognition of his undeniable impact on world events. Time's criteria wasn't about celebrating good deeds, but acknowledging who most influenced the year's news, for better or worse. By 1938, Hitler had already annexed Austria, was threatening Czechoslovakia, and had transformed Germany into a militarized state. The magazine's cover story was actually critical, describing him as a threat to Western civilization, but the choice remains controversial to this day. Other morally questionable figures have received the designation, Stalin twice, and even Ayatollah Khomeini, because the award reflects influence, not virtue. Hitler's selection serves as a reminder that by 1938, the world already knew what he was, yet the catastrophic war to stop him was still months away from beginning. Fact 27. The Wehrmacht on speed. The Nazi military issued methamphetamine tablets called Pervitin to keep soldiers awake and aggressive during the relentless pace of blitzkrieg operations. German troops called these pills Panzerschokolade, tank chocolate, or Stuka tablets, and they were distributed by the millions, 35 million tablets in 1939 alone. Soldiers could march for days without sleep, feeling invincible and fearless as they swept through Poland and France. However, the drug's dark side soon became apparent. Addiction, psychotic episodes, heart problems, and complete physical collapse when the effects wore off. By 1940, the German military began restricting Pervitin use after realizing they were creating an army of addicts. Yet the drug remained in use throughout the war, with Hitler himself receiving daily injections of methamphetamine from his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. The Führer's increasingly erratic behavior in the war's final years may have been partly drug-induced. Fact 28. Children as last defense. By 1945, Nazi Germany was so desperate that boys as young as 12 were pressed into the Volkssturm, a last-ditch militia defending German cities against Allied advances. These weren't trained soldiers, but children handed outdated rifles often, with only days or hours of training, and told to stop battle-hardened Soviet and American troops. Photographs from Berlin's final days show baby-faced boys in oversized helmets manning anti-tank weapons against Soviet T-34s. A futile and tragic sight. Hitler Youth members, indoctrinated since childhood with Nazi ideology, sometimes fought with fanatical determination despite their tender age. Some were so young they couldn't properly shoulder their rifles. As the Third Reich collapsed, these children became its last defenders, a horrifying testament to how thoroughly the Nazi regime had consumed Germany's future, sending its sons to die for a regime that was already defeated. Fact 29. Hitler's deliberate distance. Adolf Hitler, who ordered the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, never personally visited a concentration or extermination camp, maintaining a deliberate distance from the horrors committed in his name. He issued the orders, approved the plans, and knew what was happening, but avoided witnessing the industrial-scale murder machinery he'd set in motion. This wasn't ignorance or squeamishness. It was calculated deniability and psychological compartmentalization. Hitler could deliver speeches about eliminating Jews while never confronting the reality of gas chambers and crematoriums. Historians debate whether this distance made the genocide easier for him psychologically, allowing him to treat mass murder as abstract policy rather than human suffering. Meanwhile, concentration camp commandants and SS officers did the regime's bloody work, some enthusiastically, others claiming they were just following orders. Orders that ultimately traced back to a man who never witnessed the consequences firsthand. Fact 30. The feared Tiger. The German Tiger I tank was the most feared armored vehicle of World War II, capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges beyond their ability to fight back. But it was also notoriously unrealistic and prone to breakdown. With its 88mm gun and thick armor, a single Tiger could hold up entire Allied columns, and American tank crews were specifically trained to avoid engaging them directly. However, the Tiger's impressive performance came at a catastrophic cost. It was incredibly complex, absurdly expensive, and required constant maintenance. Its overlapping wheel design, while providing smooth ride, would freeze solid in Russian winter, immobilizing the tank. The Tiger consumed fuel so rapidly that many were abandoned not from battle damage but simply running out of gas. Germany produced only 1,347 Tigers during the entire war, compared to 50,000 American Sherman tanks. The Tiger was a technological marvel that Germany couldn't afford to build in sufficient numbers, a symbol of how Nazi engineering excellence couldn't overcome Allied industrial might and practical design. Fact 31. A Day of Infamy. December 7, 1941. At 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time, Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor, transforming a peaceful Sunday morning into chaos and carnage. In less than 2 hours, 353 Japanese planes attacked in 2 waves, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and killing 2,403 Americans, many still in their bunks or eating breakfast when the bombs fell. The USS Arizona exploded when a bomb penetrated its forward magazine, entombing 1,177 sailors who remain there to this day. What made the attack so devastating wasn't just the military damage, but the psychological shock. America had believed the Pacific Ocean made it invulnerable to direct attack. President Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. And he was right. The very next day, Congress declared war on Japan with only one dissenting vote, ending American isolationism and transforming the United States into the arsenal of democracy that would help win the war. Fact 32. The end of American neutrality. For over 2 years, America watched Europe burn, while officially remaining neutral, despite growing public sentiment that Hitler needed to be stopped. President Roosevelt wanted to help Britain and France, but powerful isolationist movements, remembering World War I's horrors, insisted America stay out of Europe's war. The Neutrality Acts legally prevented direct American involvement, though Roosevelt found creative ways around them, like the Lend-Lease program that provided weapons to Britain. Pearl Harbor shattered this neutrality instantly and completely. Within 4 days of the Japanese attack, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, probably Hitler's greatest strategic blunder. He just added the world's largest industrial power to his list of enemies. American factories, untouched by bombing, would soon be churning out weapons, ships, and aircraft at a pace the Axis powers couldn't match. Japan's attack didn't just awaken a sleeping giant. It unleashed an industrial juggernaut that would overwhelm them. Fact 33. Rosie the Riveter's Revolution. We can do it! The iconic poster of Rosie the Riveter became the symbol of millions of American women who flooded into factories during the war. Before 1941, heavy industrial work was considered men's work. But with 16 million men in uniform, women stepped up to fill the gap. By 1945, women made up nearly 1/3 of the American workforce, building everything from bombers to battleships. These weren't just assembly line jobs. Women operated cranes, welded steel, and handled dangerous explosives. They proved they could do the work just as well as men, earning the nickname Rosie, after the riveting work many performed on aircraft fuselages. The social impact was revolutionary. Women gained financial independence, learned technical skills, and proved their capabilities beyond traditional roles. Though many were pushed out of these jobs when soldiers returned, the precedent was set. The war had permanently changed perceptions about what women could achieve. Fact 34. The longest day. June 6, 1944. D-Day. Allied forces launched Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, with 156,000 troops landing on 5 Normandy beaches in a single day. The planning was staggering. 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and years of preparation went into this one operation. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines in darkness, many landing miles off target in flooded fields where some drowned under the weight of their equipment. At Omaha Beach, American forces faced withering German fire, turning the sand red with blood. Casualties were so heavy, commanders considered abandoning that beach entirely. Yet they pushed forward, yard by bloody yard. By nightfall, Allied forces had established a foothold in Nazi-occupied France, though at a cost of 10,000 casualties. D-Day wasn't the end of the war, but it was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The fortress of Europe had been breached, and liberation had begun. Fact 35. Roosevelt's unprecedented tenure. Franklin Delano Roosevelt remains the only American president to serve more than 2 terms, winning 4 consecutive elections from 1932 to 1944. He led America through its 2 greatest crises, the Great Depression and World War II, with a steady hand and masterful communication skills that made Americans feel connected to their leader through his famous fireside chats on radio. FDR contracted polio in 1921, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down, though he went to extraordinary lengths to hide his disability from the public. Photographs showing his wheelchair or leg braces were suppressed. By his 4th term, the strain of leading a nation at war for years had taken a devastating toll on his health. On April 12, 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage, never living to see the complete victory he'd worked so hard to achieve. His death was so shocking that the 22nd Amendment was later passed, limiting presidents to 2 terms, ensuring no one would serve as long again. Fact 36. China's Forgotten War. Japan's war didn't begin at Pearl Harbor. It started in 1937 with the invasion of China, making their conflict 8 years long and one of history's most brutal. The Sino-Japanese War saw atrocities that shocked even hardened observers, including the rape of Nanjing, where Japanese forces murdered between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians in just 6 weeks. China suffered an estimated 20 million deaths during the war. Yet their sacrifice is often overlooked in Western accounts that focus on the European and Pacific theaters. Chinese forces tied down over 1 million Japanese troops who might otherwise have fought elsewhere, and Chinese resistance prevented Japan from consolidating its conquests. The Flying Tigers, American volunteer pilots fighting for China before Pearl Harbor, became legendary for defending Chinese cities against Japanese bombers. When Japan finally surrendered in 1945, China had been fighting longer than any other nation. 8 years of relentless warfare that devastated the country and set the stage for the communist revolution that would follow. Fact 37. Death before dishonor. Japanese military culture, influenced by the Bushido warrior code, considered surrender the ultimate disgrace, leading soldiers to fight to the death in situations where any Western army would have capitulated. On Pacific islands like Saipan and Iwo Jima, Japanese defenders fought from caves and bunkers until killed, often choosing suicide over capture. When American forces finally took Saipan, hundreds of Japanese civilians, convinced by propaganda that Americans would torture them, jumped off cliffs rather than surrender, a tragedy captured in horrifying photographs. Of the 22,000 Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima, only 216 were captured alive. Most fought until killed or committed suicide. This fanatical resistance had strategic consequences. It convinced American commanders that invading the Japanese home islands would cost hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties, making the atomic bomb seem like the less costly option. The refusal to surrender wasn't just cultural. Soldiers were indoctrinated from training that capture meant eternal shame for themselves and their families. Fact 38. The soldier who fought for 29 years. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda didn't surrender until March 1974, nearly 29 years after World War II ended. Stationed on Lubang Island in the Philippines with orders to conduct guerrilla warfare, Onoda refused to believe leaflets and messages that the war was over, thinking them enemy propaganda. He and his small group of holdouts lived in the jungle, surviving on stolen food
and occasionally engaging in firefights with local police. One by one, his companions were killed or surrendered, but Onoda fought on alone for years. He was finally convinced to surrender only when his former commanding officer was brought to the island to personally relieve him of duty in 1974. Onoda emerged from the jungle in his tattered uniform, still carrying his rifle and sword, to find the world completely transformed. His story isn't unique. Other Japanese soldiers held out for years, the last known surrendering in 1980. These men became living relics, so committed to their duty that they fought a war that had ended decades earlier. Fact 39. The bombs that changed everything. Little Boy and Fat Man, the deceptively innocuous nicknames given to the atomic bombs that devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Little Boy, a uranium bomb, was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, releasing energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT and instantly killing 80,000 people. The bomb had never been tested. Scientists were so confident in its simple gun-type design that Hiroshima was its first and only use. 3 days later, Fat Man, a more complex plutonium bomb, destroyed Nagasaki, killing 40,000 more. These weren't just bigger bombs, they were fundamentally different weapons
that released the power of the atom itself. Survivors described a flash brighter than the sun, followed by a wall of heat and wind that obliterated everything. The mushroom clouds rose 7 miles high, visible for hundreds of miles. President Truman authorized their use to avoid the projected 1 million Allied casualties from invading Japan. But the decision remains one of history's most debated moral questions. Fact 40. The swift surrender. 6 days. That's all it took between the second atomic bomb falling on Nagasaki and Emperor Hirohito's unprecedented radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender. For the first time in history, ordinary Japanese citizens heard their emperor's voice, previously considered too sacred for common ears, as he announced in formal, archaic Japanese that Japan would endure the unendurable and accept defeat. Even after Nagasaki, some military leaders wanted to continue fighting, attempting a coup to prevent the surrender announcement. They failed, and on August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered unconditionally. The speed of the collapse shocked many. Just days earlier, Japan was preparing to fight to the last citizen defending the home islands. The atomic bombs, combined with the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan on August 8th, made it clear that continued resistance was suicide, not honor. The most devastating war in human history ended not with a climactic final battle, but with an emperor's quiet voice on the radio, admitting the unthinkable. Japan had lost. Fact 41. The accidental soft drink. When World War II cut off Coca-Cola's German operations from American syrup supplies, the head of Coca-Cola Deutschland, Max Keith, faced a dilemma: how to keep the business running without the secret formula. His solution was improvising a new drink from available ingredients: fruit scraps, apple pomace, and whey left over from cheese production. He told his team to use their fantasy, imagination in German, and the name stuck. Fanta was born. The original wartime Fanta tasted nothing like today's orange soda. It was more like a fruit-flavored syrup drink that Germans used to flavor soups and stews when sugar was scarce. Remarkably, Keith kept the Coca-Cola bottling plants running throughout the war, even though he had no contact with the American parent company. After the war, when Coca-Cola executives returned to Germany, they discovered Keith had faithfully protected the company's assets and even sent profits back to Atlanta. Fanta became a legitimate Coca-Cola brand, transformed from a wartime necessity into a global product. Fact 42. The armed neutrality. Switzerland remained officially neutral throughout World War II, but neutrality didn't mean passivity. The Swiss military maintained constant readiness, prepared to defend every mountain pass and tunnel with fierce determination. The Swiss strategy was brilliantly defensive. If invaded, they would retreat to the fortified Alpine redoubt, destroy all tunnels connecting Switzerland to the rest of Europe, and make occupation impossibly costly. Every bridge and tunnel was wired with explosives, ready to be demolished at a moment's notice. Swiss men served in the militia, keeping rifles at home and regularly training for war that might come any day. Hitler actually drafted plans to invade Switzerland in Operation Tannenbaum, but the estimated cost, occupying a nation of armed, mountaineering marksmen in fortress terrain, always seemed too high. Switzerland also provided valuable services to both sides: banking, diplomatic channels, and a place where spies from all nations operated openly. Their neutrality was armed, expensive, and meticulously prepared. A small nation surviving by making invasion more trouble than it was worth. Fact 43. The road to Berlin. The Soviet advance from Stalingrad to Berlin covered over 1,300 miles of some of the most brutal fighting in human history. After breaking the German siege at Stalingrad in February 1943, the Red Army began the long, bloody push westward, liberating Soviet territory village by village, city by city. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 became the largest tank battle ever fought, with over 6,000 tanks clashing across the Russian steppe. Germany's last major offensive in the east failed spectacularly. Soviet forces then drove through Ukraine, Poland, and finally into Germany itself, their advance fueled by both military might and vengeful fury for what the Nazis had done to their homeland. By April 1945, Soviet artillery was shelling Berlin directly as Hitler cowered in his bunker beneath the city. On April 30th, Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag building, captured in one of the war's most iconic photographs. The price was staggering. Soviet casualties from Stalingrad to Berlin exceeded millions, but they'd accomplished what seemed impossible in 1941, destroying the Wehrmacht and capturing Hitler's capital. Fact 44. The buried threat. World War II scattered an estimated 110 million landmines across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Lethal seeds that continue killing and maiming people 80 years later. In France, the Zone Rouge, red zone, remains so contaminated with unexploded ordnance from both world wars that areas are still forbidden for human habitation. German cities regularly halt construction when workers uncover massive unexploded bombs that must be carefully defused and removed. In 2017, a 1.8-ton British bomb forced the evacuation of 60,000 people in Frankfurt. Farmers across Europe still plow up rusty grenades, shells, and mines every year, casualties mounting even in peacetime. In Cambodia and Laos, American cluster bombs dropped during later conflicts continue killing children who mistake them for toys. Specialized bomb disposal teams work constantly, but experts estimate it will take centuries to clear all World War II ordnance. The war ended in 1945, but its buried weapons remain, a dangerous reminder that conflicts echo through generations. Fact 45. Poland's secret army. The Polish underground state wasn't just a resistance movement. It was a complete shadow government operating under Nazi occupation, with its own military, courts, schools, and intelligence services. From 1939 onward, the Armia Krajowa, Home Army, built an organization that, at its peak, numbered 400,000 members, making it the largest resistance movement in occupied Europe. Polish agents infiltrated Nazi facilities, photographed V-2 rocket parts, and smuggled them to Britain, and provided crucial intelligence about concentration camps. They operated secret schools, because the Nazis banned Polish education, and published underground newspapers to counter German propaganda. The Warsaw Uprising of 1944, though ultimately crushed by the Germans, saw the Home Army seize control of Poland's capital for 63 days, a feat unmatched by any other resistance movement. Tragically, Stalin allowed the Nazis to destroy the Polish resistance before Soviet forces liberated Warsaw, eliminating potential opposition to communist rule. The Polish underground fought two enemies, first the Nazis, then the Soviets, a struggle that continued long after 1945. Fact 46. Desert ships of war. In North Africa's vast deserts, both Allied and Axis forces relied on an ancient mode of transportation, camel caravans, to move supplies where trucks couldn't reach. Italian and German forces in Libya employed Bedouin guides with camels to transport ammunition, water, and supplies across trackless sand, where motorized vehicles would become hopelessly stuck. The British Long-Range Desert Group, operating behind enemy lines, sometimes used camels alongside their modified trucks when stealth was essential. Camels made no mechanical noise and required no fuel. These operations created surreal scenes: machine guns mounted on camel saddles, ancient caravan routes becoming strategic supply lines, and nomadic tribesmen finding themselves caught between modern armies fighting with tanks and aircraft. The desert campaigns proved that even in mechanized warfare, sometimes the most reliable transportation was four-legged, and had been used for centuries. War correspondents wrote home about the incongruity of watching armored divisions moving past camel trains, the ancient and modern colliding in the Saharan vastness. Fact 47. Operation Barbarossa's betrayal. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in military history, sending 3.8 million German troops crashing across the Soviet border. This violated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the non-aggression treaty signed just 2 years earlier that had stunned the world by aligning Nazi Germany with Communist Soviet Union. Stalin had ignored dozens of warnings about the impending invasion, convinced Hitler wouldn't attack while still fighting Britain. The initial German onslaught was devastating. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed, millions of soldiers captured, and the Red Army seemingly on the verge of collapse. German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow by December 1941, close enough to see the Kremlin's spires through binoculars. But Hitler had miscalculated catastrophically. He'd assumed the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks, like France had. Instead, Operation Barbarossa became a quagmire that would ultimately destroy the Wehrmacht. The Eastern Front became a meat grinder, consuming millions of lives, and Hitler's betrayal of Stalin transformed the Soviet Union from neutral bystander into the force that would plant its flag over Berlin. Fact 48. The civilian catastrophe. More than 40 million civilians died in World War II, a staggering number that exceeded military deaths and revealed the war's total brutality. This wasn't collateral damage, it was systematic. The Holocaust murdered 6 million Jews. Stalin's purges and forced relocations killed millions of Soviets. Japanese atrocities in China claimed countless lives, and strategic bombing reduced cities to rubble with civilians inside. The siege of Leningrad alone killed over 1 million civilians through starvation. People ate wallpaper paste, leather belts, and some resorted to cannibalism to survive. Allied firebombing of Dresden, Tokyo, and Hamburg created firestorms that incinerated tens of thousands in single nights. In occupied territories, civilians faced arbitrary executions, forced labor, and starvation as occupiers stripped countries bare. The line between combatant and civilian dissolved. Total war meant everyone was a target. Children, elderly, mothers, fathers, 40 million ordinary people whose only crime was living through the deadliest conflict in human history. Their deaths represent more than statistics. They're 40 million individual tragedies, 40 million futures erased. Fact 49. Justice at Nuremberg. The Nuremberg trials brought 24 major Nazi leaders before an international tribunal, the first time in history that national leaders were prosecuted for crimes against humanity. From November 1945 to October 1946, the world watched as Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, and other architects of Nazi atrocities faced justice in the same city where Hitler had held his massive rallies. Prosecutors presented mountains of evidence: concentration camp footage, Nazi documentation of their own crimes, and testimony from survivors. The Nazis had been so confident of victory they'd kept meticulous records of everything, which now condemned them. 12 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging. Goering cheated the gallows by swallowing cyanide hours before his scheduled execution. The trials established groundbreaking legal principles. Following orders was no defense for war crimes, and government officials could be held personally accountable for atrocities committed under their authority. These principles shaped international law and led to subsequent war crimes. Tribunals. Justice was imperfect. Many Nazis escaped prosecution, but Nuremberg sent an unmistakable message. Even the powerful could be held accountable for monstrous acts. Fact 50. Birth of the United Nations. On October 24, 1945, the United Nations officially came into existence, born directly from humanity's determination that World War II's horrors must never happen again. 51 nations signed the UN Charter in San Francisco, creating an organization designed to prevent future wars through diplomacy, collective security, and international cooperation. The League of Nations, formed after World War I, had failed catastrophically to prevent the second global conflict, so the UN was built with more power and broader membership. The Security Council, with 5 permanent members, the United States, Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China, reflected the war's power dynamics and gave these nations veto power to prevent decisions that might lead to another world war. The UN Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, was drafted largely in response to Holocaust atrocities, establishing universal standards for human dignity. While imperfect and often gridlocked by great power politics, the UN represented humanity's hope that international cooperation could replace international conflict, that dialogue might prevent another 70 million deaths. The world's most devastating war had taught a terrible lesson, and the UN was humanity's attempt to learn from it. That's it for today. We hope you learned something new. Don't forget to subscribe, and see you next time.